Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's training, we have an activity for folks to do. So on menti.com, folks can enter this code 8150-21252, and you can put in as many words as you want. There's at least 10 options to describe what is one word that describes your feelings with bystander intervention. Alrighty. So let's go to the results. So folks here today have said that a word that describes your feelings with bystander intervention includes words such as action, courage, protection, protective, moving forward, brave, help, advocate, curious, ally, interruption, proactive, uncomfortability, and important. Yeah, so a lot of these words have come up before in the brainstorming of this event and in preparation for it. And we'll be diving into some of these feelings later today. So for today's workshop, we want to provide some accessibility instructions for this call. For those participating on Zoom, we have English live transcription enabled. If you would like to turn it on or off, you can access it via the lower right-hand corner. There should be a button that says live transcription for those on computers. For those on cellular devices, you may click the three dots icon to access those settings. For those joining us on Facebook, the lower right-hand side of the video will have a settings icon for you to enable subtitles. And for those watching on YouTube in the future, captions will be auto-generated. At this time, we don't have ASL interpreters, so American Sign Language interpreters, or non-English interpretation services available. There is no excuse for not making this event and past UNAVSA events more accessible to our community members. So we just want to take accountability and apologize for not being able to provide them today. Participants are welcome to turn their cameras on or off, whatever makes y'all feel more comfortable during this call. Please take care of your body, mind, and do what you need to do to ground yourself during this call. Welcome to today's training on rape culture intervention. Before we dive into the workshop, we'd like to take a few more minutes to just introduce the organization and some guidelines for today. The Union of North American Vietnamese Student Associations is a 501c3 nonprofit community-based organization. UNAVSA is dedicated to cultivating the next generation of leaders who will serve as stewards of the Vietnamese community. UNAVSA's mission is to empower the next generation of Vietnamese leaders with a passion for service, propensity for leadership, and self-awareness with the intent of advocating for progress in the North American Vietnamese community. As a volunteer-led, volunteer-run organization, we rely on personal donations of our community members and organization partners to sustain our work. To support this event and other UNAVSA content, you can make a donation on this link over here on the next slide, please. Next up, we would like to provide a land acknowledgement. As we continue our journey learning about the history and current process of colonization and displacement on this continent, we encourage members to educate about the land on which you're located. As a starting point, you can type in native-land.ca in your web browser. There, you can find the original stewards of the land you're on. We also want to highlight the following from nativelands.ca. Territory acknowledgement is a way that people insert an awareness of Indigenous presence and land rights in everyday life. This is often done at the beginning of ceremonies, lectures, and other public events. It can be a subtle way to recognize the history of colonialism and a need for change in settler colonial societies. Personally, I'm calling in from Lenape-Hoking, land of the Lenape peoples. On the next slide. The land upon which we gather is part of the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape, called Lenape-Hoking. The Lenape people lived in harmony with one another upon this territory for thousands of years. During the colonial era and early federal period, Many were removed west and north, but some also remain among the continuing historical tribal communities of the region. The Nanticoke Lenni Lenape tribal nation, the Ramapo Lenape nation, and the Powhatan Lenape nation, the Nanticoke of Millsboro, Delaware, and the Lenape of Cheswold, Delaware. We acknowledge the Lenni Lenape as the original peoples of the land and their continuing relationship with the territory. In our acknowledgement of the continued presence of Lenape people in their homeland, we affirm the aspiration of the great Lenape chief, Tamanend, that there be harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of immigrants to this land. Quote, as long as the rivers and creeks flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine. Next slide. Land acknowledgements are not in the past tense, as colonialism is an ongoing process, and we need to build our mindfulness in our present participation and be in solidarity with movements such as Land Back and stopping land destruction efforts such as deforestation, fracking, and pipelines. We also need to observe the ways that the various systems of oppression such as white supremacy, cishet patriarchy, capitalism, and ableism are upheld by the same settler colonial state structures in both the United States and Canada. To be anti-racist and anti-oppressive is to be abolitionist. For further discourse on this, viewers can access our UNAVSA via Advocacy Week Day 2 event, Abolition Teach-In, on our YouTube and Facebook pages. A link will be provided to the public and to participants after this call. We also want to provide a content and trigger warning since this workshop addresses various forms and levels of harm and sexual violence. In the scenario section later today, we will provide additional content warnings listed where necessary. Some of the things that we'll be talking about today are rape culture, sexual violence, policing, prisons, and other forms of harm. Next up, we would like to introduce ourselves. Charlie, you just go first.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pong. So my name is Charlie Nguyen. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a queer Viet Man, and I'm based on Piscataway land, also known as Baltimore, Maryland today. And I've been in the VSA space for a while through leadership at my own school in undergrad, as well as through UNAVSA for the past 2 to 3 years. And a little bit about my background. I've been an educator in gender violence and bystander intervention for about 3 to 4 years during my undergrad time. So hopefully I'm looking forward to bringing some of that experience to our workshop today. And I'll pass it on to Pong.
Thanks, Charlie. Hello, everyone. My name is Pong. I use he, him, his pronouns. I am a gay, queer, Thai, cisgender man based in New York City. I'm also an abolitionist socialist organizer outside this space. One of my fellow organizers says that there is no resistance to capitalism that has not been met with batons. These skills I bring into the space are empathy, disruption, and critical analysis of systems of oppression, including things like state violence. I'm the current secretary of UNAVSA, where I've contributed to some of our community safety initiatives and projects. And just for some positionality, I'm not a survivor of rape or other forms of interpersonal violence or severe physical harm. I come to this work as a mediator, facilitator, and scholar who studies these things and experiments new ways of both sustaining and uplifting things like access, love, and safety in my spaces. And I firmly believe that we are the ones that keep us safe. For further context about UNAVSA, since fall 2020, UNAVSA has begun addressing harm and working on safety strategies based on things like restorative justice, transformative justice, and community accountability values. We are working to build up our constituency's capacity and skill sets to respond to things like harm and violence, and to really create the foundations for what a community-based response can look like instead of relying on things like policing, prisons, and punishment. And this workshop reflects those intentions and values. Today we'll be covering a multitude of related topics, namely what is rape culture. Then we're going to be talking about the continuum of sexual violence and its relationship to rape culture. We'll be doing 2 activities, followed by some information on bystander intervention, as well as an activity. And then we'll be closing off with sharing references, resources, and offering space for questions and answers. So we have some training expectations that we want to set very clear on. So firstly, this training is for, number 1, sharing tips and building on each other's collective knowledge. All of us are trying to think of ways to undo the conditioning that allows for and perpetuates sexual violence. It's also a space for practicing these scenarios to build up our confidence when intervening as like a third party or even with strangers. And this training is also for building up our toolbox of resources in order to reduce harm when we see it happening. Some boundaries that we're setting up is that this training is not for acting like any of us are the experts. We don't have all the answers because we believe that there is no one answer. And that's the point of it, right? We all have experiences and knowledge that challenges rape culture. Rape culture is something that affects our communities as a collective. And so to dismantle it and abolish it requires the community to come together to respond. This training is also not for providing a one-step model to address harm and intervene in rape culture. There are many variables that can change, like how and when we can intervene. Every situation is different, and there are aspects of our own identities that can affect our decisions. And this space is a place for to provide skill sharing so that you can feel more confident and equipped to intervene. The last boundary that we're sharing is that this training is really not for like current or prospective police, active military, prosecutors, or other law enforcement agents. If your job or career is nestled within the prison industrial complex or military industrial complex within this framework of crime and punishment and empire, one of the best things that you can do is quit your jobs because your institutions were designed as and uphold rape culture. We'll be making the argument later today that these are actually sites of rape and violence. For those joining us on Zoom and Facebook, we'll be providing the slides with these community agreements below. So here are our community standards and agreements. This curriculum will center healing. We support survivor determination. We also believe that there is no perfect victim or survivor, as anyone can be either or both or neither. And we just want to hold those complexities today. We also uplift the following agreements created by AORTA, the Anti-Oppression Resource and Training Alliance, namely one person, one mic. So one person will speak at a time. No one knows everything, but together we know a lot. Move up, move up. Move up into speaking if you listen more, and feel free to move up into listening if you tend to speak more. Next up, we can't be articulate all the time. Please be aware of time. Embrace curiosity. And acknowledge the difference between intent and impact. Oftentimes people's intentions are good. However, that doesn't mean that no harm is done or committed. We would also like to provide some space for our participants to propose further agreements. And so we're going to hold about 2 to 3 minutes for that if anyone would like to share. Okay, so there are no further suggestions on the Zoom or the Facebook, so let's move forward. So today's training goals will be using an abolitionist framework of community-based strategies to respond to rape and rape culture behaviors. So 3 key points of that is number 1, identifying the conditions that enables rape culture. Number 2, understanding the ways rape and violence is upheld by communities and institutions. And number 3, practicing bystander and upstander strategies to reduce harm in the moment. So what is rape culture? So today's workshop is based on the Toolkit by the Hope Praxis Collective, of which has inspired most of the slides in our lesson today. So they define rape culture as a society or environment whose prevailing social attitudes have the effect of normalizing or trivializing sexual assault and abuse. Rape culture is complex and is upheld through many layers in our society. In the next exercise, we're going to start to conceptualize those different layers and complexities of rape culture. And for folks attending, you don't have to worry about trying to paint a complete picture. Everyone in a lot of institutions are involved in rape culture to some degree. So this next activity is for us to have a deeper conversation on like the how. So how are individuals involved? How do institutions reproduce rape culture? And how can these structures illuminate different tactics of organizing and intervening for us in response to rape culture? So we'll be providing a Jamboard for participants right now on the next slide. So folks can access the Jamboard here. And some guiding questions for this activity are, number one, who are the individuals involved with rape culture? Number two, who are the institutions and what systems are involved with rape culture? What are the cultural understandings associated with rape culture? And number four, how do these interact with and reinforce one another? All right, so just a 3-minute heads up. So we're going to resume with the rest of the presentation at 7:33 p.m. Eastern time, 4:33 p.m. Pacific time.
All right. So thank you everyone for engaging in that mind mapping activity. In the interest of time, we can't read every single one of these, but just to read out a few of these, you all had some really great thoughts about kind of conceptualizing rape culture and really understanding that it's more than just something that's one-dimensional. It involves people, institutions, culture, and they all interact with each other. So as an example, in the realm of the individuals who are involved in rape culture, some of you mentioned people who make harmless jokes, and harmless in air quotes, or in quotation marks, rape apologists, or people who say they didn't do it to me, so they're okay. And then looking broader at the institutional level, we have schools, student orgs, which is something super relevant to us at our age, with a lot of us being involved in Vietnamese student associations, in Greek life, and even looking at beyond the student level, seeing that there could be a lack of office or university support for survivors, and there really is a lack of that, and the policies and procedures that they set up. And then things that are a little bit more insidious would be things that are built into culture. So using the word rape in phrases like saying things are at rape prices, or even ideological thoughts like boys will be boys. And another one is asking a survivor whether they used alcohol or what they were wearing. So a lot of these really do interact with each other, not only within one level, but across levels. So you'll see how some of these cultural beliefs, some of these institutions really end up insulating these individuals in the middle who are engaging in this behavior and these values. So I'm going to pass it back to Pong. Thank you everyone again for engaging in that.
Yeah, thank you everyone. And thank you, Charlie, for reading it aloud. Next slide, please. So just to build upon what all of us have shared together in this collective, co-creation space, here are some other aspects of rape culture that the Hope Praxis Collective highlighted. So rape culture is a culture in which sexual violence is treated as the norm and victims are blamed for their own assaults. And when we talk about rape culture, again, it's not just about the sexual violence itself, right? but what are the cultural norms and institutions around us that, number one, protect the people who rape others, number two, promote impunity, shame victims, and demand that people make like totally unreasonable sacrifices to avoid sexual assault. Like some of the terrible questions that some of us in here may have seen before that are posed to survivors are things like, what were you wearing? Did you lead them on? Did you have a prior relationship with that person? Really policing like folks' autonomy in their clothing, their makeup products, and just people's choices. So rape culture treats rape as a problem to be solved through improving the behavior of potential rape survivors rather than preventing the sexual violence in and of itself. So what this does is this puts a lot of the responsibility and the blame on survivor victims, victim survivors, or survivors. So this is known as victim blaming. And so when we're talking about ending rape culture, it shouldn't be focused on policing the behaviors and the choices of survivors. The people that actually need to change their behaviors are the ones that are doing the harm, right? And if we extend that argument a little bit more, so the responsibility isn't on the most vulnerable and shouldn't be on the most vulnerable to interpersonal and state violence. For example, Black and brown, queer and trans, disabled, immigrant women and non-men to stop rape and murder. It is on the institutions that are the sites of violence. It is from those who benefit from things like patriarchy, the ones who oppress, who normalize oppressive violence in our communities through socialization that need to change, right? Those are the things that need to be abolished. Another aspect of rape culture is that a survivor's identity also impacts how well they will be believed and their assumed innocence in the eyes of the system, whether or not they choose to disclose their experience of assault. So again, sometimes survivors are just not believed, right? Prison industrial complex abolition is crucial to bring justice to survivors and to build a world free of rape culture. Next slide. So according to the survivors agenda, sexual misconduct claims accounted for the second highest category of complaints against law enforcement officers after use of things like excessive force, meaning that the very systems that are tasked, that some of us believe, right, are responsible for providing safety, are actually the ones that perpetuate harm and fail survivors. And this is another reason why community responses and interventions to rape culture are so important to develop. The survivors agenda also states, the next slide, we are calling for a transformation of culture that centers the experiences of all survivors. A culture that doesn't tolerate or make excuses for the abuse, violence, and harassment by those in power. A culture that encourages being active in preventing and disrupting violence when aware of harmful situations, rather than being a bystander. And a culture that is supportive of survivors of sexual violence, going beyond just believing survivors to actively promoting and developing a culture of prevention, accountability, and healing. So now we're going to analyze some of the things, like what happens when harm isn't addressed the moment that it occurs. As in the previous activity, we didn't really weigh harms against each other. So we're going to be looking at the relationship that unhealed harms and violence have to one another as time progresses. We're going to be showing a short video clip at this moment.
I think a lot of harm that happens it's like death by 1,000 cuts, little cuts. And we often don't pay attention until there's so many little cuts that we're bleeding out. And then we rush to, we rush to the crisis and the emergency and we drop everything. But what if we started rushing and dropping everything when the little cuts happen, or when there's just maybe 4 or 5 little cuts instead of when we're bleeding out? I think about that when I think about responding to violence and harm without creating more violence and harm, because I think a lot of that to me speaks to how do we operate in a more long-term understanding of violence, a more generational understanding of violence, so that, that we move past just the immediacy of a feeling of revenge, or that we need to get back at somebody, for example, or a feeling of hopelessness, to actually say, this is an opportunity that I can respond to this. I can either respond to it with more violence and harm, right, and escalate it, or I can take this opportunity to figure out, how do I de-escalate this, and what would that look like?
Oh, so that was Mia Mingus of the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective. She is a wonderful disability justice, transformative justice organizer. I was actually attending a workshop with her yesterday. But yeah, she provided a lot of insight on this topic and just anti-violence, period. So when we talk about harm and violence, sometimes we think about like the most full-blown severe acts like murder or rape, right? So for example, in VSA spaces, we saw this past year, and even prior to that, the most public like mobilization and calls to action tended to have revolved around like those severe acts like sexual assault, like intimate partner violence. And when we're trying to undo rape culture, yes, that's good. And we also need to be able to identify these smaller acts of harm that we may commit to one another intentionally, unintentionally. Harm is something that can contract or expand as time goes on if it's unaddressed. And we have a responsibility to respond to these things so that we don't continue to uphold rape culture, and we don't continue to do things like punish or abandon or coerce or further perpetuate oppressive violence. So the chart that's on the slide right here, just a brief explanation of it. The x-axis, so the bottom horizontal line, it represents the time. Meanwhile, the y-axis, so the vertical line on the left, represents the intensity or the severity. The graph shows that over time, the intensity of harm dramatically increases if not addressed. Charlie, you can just click every like 10 seconds. So the curve is broken up into 3 phases. In lower 1, a lower level harm occurs. Examples of this can be things like name calling, not respecting people's boundaries, and so on. And when phase 1 harms are not addressed, it may escalate into phase 2 harms. So for example, name calling can escalate to something like invading your partner's privacy, checking your partner's social media accounts on their phone without their consent, showing up to someone's workplace unannounced to intimidate other people or that person themselves. So in this phase, the harm has not escalated to a full-blown crisis yet, but the violence that's occurring like adds up, right? And what this does is that it takes more time and effort to address these and to heal from these compared to phase 1. One key thing to note when looking at this chart and just intellectualizing it in this way is that it doesn't always have to be like one situation leading directly to another. It can also just be that if we allow a phase 1 harm, like name calling, for example, just happen without addressing it, it perpetuates an environment of rape culture where phase 2 harms are more likely to be allowed to happen too without being addressed or folks being accounted for. Finally, phase 3 shows that the intensity of unaddressed harms can escalate to the point of extreme violence. So those full-blown acts, right? So examples of this are things like rape, physical abuse and violence, which are 2 different things, and murder. So the phase 3 harms, they're often the hardest to deal with because they exhaust the most resources and they use up the most resources for folks to address these things. For each of the phases on this continuum, we have some suggestions for community members to take when you witness yourself or others commit these behaviors. We also want to make it clear that we're not saying that change behavior on this like individual level will, miraculously uproot and like dismantle rape culture. So these points that we're suggesting and talking about are meant for us to begin discussions about the different ways that we can address these violences in non-punitive ways. So for example, in level 1 harms, if you cross someone's boundaries, right? If you say something that makes them feel uncomfortable or unsafe or triggering or invasive, one of the things that you can do if you were the one that did it is to just recognize what has happened, to acknowledge that you hurt someone in this way, and then offer an apology, which the survivor/victim does not have to accept, but you can just apologize for crossing that boundary and to make amends if possible. And this situation that I just explained can be used for other phase 1 harms as well. So for example, I promised that I was going to send out an email to some UNAVSA staff members by a certain date, and I ended up not doing it, which delayed other people's work and organizing. But when I had the chance to, I just apologized and I took accountability for the delays to onboarding new staff members, for example. Sorry. Yeah, so apologies don't have to be scary. So a phase 2 harm, so these things are a bit more severe, right? So maybe someone you know is threatened with violence by another person. So a way to address this harm as a community is to really center that person's needs as soon as possible, if folks have the bandwidth and capacity to do so. Maybe you can find a safe place for a person to stay if it's not their home, or maybe if they're unhoused, right? We have to talk about the long term and really build up our support systems and our support network. One of the transformative justice tools that Nina Mingus and the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective created is this thing called pods. And essentially it's a way to really materialize tangible people that you would rely on when harm occurs. So for example, you can stay over a friend's apartment. Another suggestion for disrupting those level 2 harms could be also having a trusted de-escalator who knows how to mediate and facilitate situations of violence. Someone who isn't a cop to the person that threatened them, and is willing to see that the person that's threatening them or harming them is willing to stop the behavior and also follow through any type of safety needs of the survivor. So phase 3 is much harder, right? That's just honestly, it is much harder. But for all 4 of these examples of level 3 harms, the suggestions offered in phase 2 can still be applicable. So for the first 3 acts of violence, for example, we should still center the safety needs of survivors. Maybe they need things like monetary support, right? Like money for healthcare, seeing a doctor, therapy, getting groceries, just being with them. And every situation is different. And a strategy for the person who did the harm is something that we've talked about before in UNAVSA spaces, is that we can find ways, and often this is harder, to get that person to acknowledge what has happened, to get them to stop that behavior, and if possible, to make amends. And that could look like a public or private apology, depending on the survivor and the community. That could be agreeing to leaving a shared space, such as an organization, right? That could be not contacting the survivor. It really depends on the situation. So now that we've gone over these suggestions to harm, I would like us to just reflect on our experiences. If you have pieces of paper, or if you can just open a document online, or you can just brainstorm yourself and just reflect on these two primary questions. So what can de-escalating harm look like in your community, organizations, and relationships? And if that doesn't exist, or maybe it's not as sufficient right now, what do you want it to look like? And we're going to spend about 3 minutes on that.
All right. So hopefully you all got a chance to reflect and really think about these questions, whether on your own or writing them down. Did anyone want to share any of their thoughts? You can either do so in the chat or unmute. I also have my eye on the Facebook comments as well. And if you don't feel comfortable making it be known who you are in sharing that, you can also send me a DM on Zoom through Charlie, he, him is my username. So feel free to shoot me a private message as well. All right, so I got a private message saying it looks like educating others in the VSA space and in our communities. I think that is an amazing answer. Really spreading the knowledge about what it means to de-escalate harm and really intervening there. Any other thoughts? That was a really great one. All right, feel free to keep reflecting on this, but for now, we are going to take a short 5-minute break. So please use this time to use the restroom, drink some water, and rest your eyes and do whatever you need to feel comfortable before we move into the next section. And we'll give it about 5 minutes. So if you all could come back at 8 p.m. ET or 5 p.m. PT, we will see you in a moment. All right, so hope everyone had a great break, and thanks everyone for engaging with us so far. As a reminder, please feel free to also take care of your needs throughout the rest of the presentation. It doesn't have to be during a scheduled break. But to go on to this next section, with Pong earlier, we just went over the foundations of what we need to know to intervene in rape culture, from understanding what it is, to understanding transformative justice, to really the different ways where it might show up on that continuum we saw earlier. But we also went over a few suggestions for disrupting that harm at each level. But what we want to do now for the rest of this presentation is really making this a little bit more tangible, and all learn together about some strategies to intervene specifically. So I want to start off with a quick discussion to get us started, and you can either type in the chat or unmute. And again, you can also share in the Facebook comments or send me a private message as well. What are some reasons why a bystander would choose not to intervene in a situation of harm? And I'll give that about 1 to 2 minutes. All right. So I'm seeing some answers come up in the chat so far. So one of our participants in the Zoom room said they might not know how. And that is a really good answer, because when you're in the moment, it might be difficult to really know what to do, especially if you haven't been exposed to some strategies on how to do that. So that's a great response. Anyone else? I'm getting a private message as well. So someone's saying, feeling like intervening would be embarrassing. And that is also a really good one that I feel like a lot of people don't talk about. You might have some type of relationship with the people in the situation. Like they might be a close friend or someone you just met, and you don't want to damage that relationship. So that could be another reason why people might not intervene. Any others? How about safety? So you might be in a situation where, oh yeah, and someone in our Zoom room just said that. They might feel unsafe, and whether that be physically or emotionally, it might not always be the right situation to intervene in a certain way. And another person said, I get hesitant when I see the person doing violence is bigger than me, or if they have more people with them than I do. And that is also a great response. Also, a reminder of the idea of safety as well. And a few that come to my mind are also, sometimes it might not feel like it's too urgent, but again, we want to think back to what we mentioned in that last section, what Pong mentioned about how even the level 1 harms are situations where we should be intervening and disrupting. All right. So it looks like that's all the responses for now, but thank you everyone for engaging in that. And one common thread I sort of heard throughout all of these, and I'm getting another response right now, they might be unsure of what's happening or if they should intervene. That's also great as well, is really looking at these common threads between these responses is the idea that intervening might cause even more harm, either to the other person or to yourself. And that's really important to think about, right? So what we really want to do in this part of the workshop is thinking about ways to sort of build up the skills that Pong mentioned earlier and really be able to come up with these strategies to overcome some of these fears that we might have in intervening without causing more harm in the moment. And some of the strategies that we want to talk about today specifically, we summarize as the 5 Ds of bystander intervention. And some of you might have heard these before. It's direct, distract, delegate, delay, and document. And these aren't listed in any particular order. We do want to note that in the Hope Praxis Collective Toolkit, they really mentioned 4 of these: direct, distract, delegate, and delay. We added on document, which a lot of other groups also talk about as well. So let's go over each of these and define them. So the first D is direct, and this one is kind of self-explanatory in the name. It means responding directly to the individual causing harm in the moment, whether that be saying something to them in a real world situation, or even DMing them in a virtual situation and saying things like, hey, that is not okay, or stop that, or what are you doing? And right off the bat, you really have to think about some of those factors that we mentioned earlier when you're going to intervene directly. And the most important thing to think about is safety, and really thinking about whether it would be safe for you to intervene directly, whether it would escalate something or cause more harm. And I have this picture on the right over here where the person intervening is saying, are you okay? And that is super important because when you're intervening directly, you should also check in with the person who's being harmed afterward as well. With the second D is distract. And this is always one that gets people talking whenever I'm in these workshops. And this is when you distract either the person causing harm or the person experiencing harm in a situation. One of my fellow educators used to give a really good example whenever we would teach together. And she would say how whenever she's in a situation like at a party or at a bar and she witnesses harm, she would stumble on the person and act drunk and spill their drink. I also had another fellow trainer who would pretend that there's like a bee on the person's shoulder and use that as a way to distract. But obviously that also can vary from situation to situation and depending on the level of safety. And I think one thing that I didn't mention earlier, which is important in thinking about safety, but one of our participants did highlight, is safety is also subjective, right? So depending on the situation, you might be physically smaller than the other person, or you might be from a group that faces marginalization and it's not as safe for you to intervene using direct or distract. So definitely keep that in mind. So the next strategy would be delegating. And this one is either getting someone to intervene for you or bringing in another person to help intervene using any of the 2 methods that I just mentioned. And this can be really useful because having more people can help with that safety aspect, and the person you delegate might have more power in that situation, in that specific context. So as an example, maybe you could bring in a person who might be more trusted by the people in that situation, or they might even have the authority to help remove or diffuse that situation. Right. Another strategy that we have for intervening is delay. So far we've been talking about really intervening in the moment, but again, I keep bringing up the idea of safety. And if it's not safe, you might choose to delay the intervening by checking in with the person experiencing harm after the person causing harm leaves. And this could look like, in a physical space, the person might have left the room already and you're still there to check in on people. Or if you're in a virtual space, maybe it could be after the Zoom meeting. And this really gives you the chance to see if the person is okay, offer resources, or see if you can accompany them anywhere. And this really is a reminder of what Pong mentioned earlier. Some of the strategies really can happen after the harm occurring. All right, and the last D that we're going to be talking about today is documenting details of the harm that occurred, whether through screenshots, video recordings, or noting details. So for this one, in addition to thinking about safety as always, we also want to check to make sure that if it's at all possible, see that another person is also intervening in the moment before choosing to document that. So the way that's illustrated in this picture right here is there's someone recording on the left, but someone is also directly intervening in the middle as well. And the other thing is after you document, you should be sure to ask the person who experienced the harm what you should be doing with the documentation. So if you look on the right over there, you really don't want to be posting things online without the person's consent, especially when their agency might have been taken away already in experiencing the harm. And this could even cause more harm depending on how vulnerable that person is if you were to share that online, for example. So I know that was a lot of information and I'm sort of out of breath going through all those 5. But those were the 5 Ds in a nutshell. And just going back to the slide to sort of recap, we have direct, distract, delegate, delay, and document. And again, just really want to emphasize that these can either be used in person or online. And if anyone has any questions so far, please feel free to type that in the chat or in the Facebook comments. All right, so a few do's and don'ts when it comes to intervening that we really want to think about are on the screen right here. I know I sound like a broken record at this point, but please assess your surroundings and really think about safety. You know, that could look like seeing if there are others nearby, seeing if you and the person who experienced the harm can move to a safer space. Another do would be making sure that your presence is known. If it's safe to do so. For example, if you were to take the delay or the document option, you might want to make eye contact with the person who's experiencing the harm to see if they want the support, or even doing that eye contact before engaging in the distract or the direct, just to make sure that that person is always giving the cue, which leads into the next one right there. And when you're really trying to follow the person who's experienced the harm, that could also look like, you know, asking them directly, like, would you like me to walk with me, or would you like to walk with me over here? And really following their lead, because again, that person might have reasons why you shouldn't be approaching them in a particular moment. And also notice if the person being harassed is resisting in their own way and honoring that. And this is something that we think about a lot when it comes to people who happen to have privilege in different ways. So for example, with white folks particularly, there's this issue of tone policing. And that could really happen in a context where someone is facing harm. And of course, always check in with the person who's being harassed after the incident is over. And now for some don'ts. The first one we have up here is don't call the police. And this is really consistent with what we've been talking about earlier in terms of institutions that cause harm, in terms of making sure we're not causing more harm, and really uplifting the values that the Hope Praxis Collective really emphasized in their toolkit. And this is really being cognizant because there are communities who have been historically and continue to face harm right now from incarceration and the police, including Arab and Muslim communities, Black people, queer and trans folks, Indigenous communities, and immigrants. And the police have really caused a greater danger for the person facing the harm. Don't escalate the situation. And finally, don't do nothing. If you find yourself too nervous or too afraid, or even if it might not be as safe of a situation, there are ways to still signal your support with your body, whether it be making eye contact, like I mentioned earlier, or even inching your body closer to the person. So again, that was a lot of information, but please feel free to ask any additional questions in the chat. All right. So for this last section of our workshop, we really want to drill it down and bring it closer to our own contexts and our own situations that we might be running into, especially those of us who are still in the student organization space and especially the VSA space. So I'm looking at the Zoom room and it's looking like we have a good number of people to make this a group discussion. So I'm going to start off with these scenarios, and what we're going to do is we're going to be reading these out loud, and then if anyone has thoughts on what might be a good way to intervene in the situation or what you might do in the situation, definitely type that in the chat or feel free to signal that you want to unmute and offer your thoughts. And same for those of you who are on Facebook, feel free to leave a comment. Right. So for our first scenario, we have you, and we're identifying that in terms of identity, you are a cis straight Viet male, and you're at a VSA GBM, and you overhear a cis straight male VSA member say that they are planning to attend a regional UVSA event to find a VS Bay and get an AVG no matter what. And they view this event as an opportunity to seek out women in this way. What do you do? And for those of you who aren't familiar, VSA stands for Vietnamese Student Association, GBM stands for General Body Meeting, and UVSA stands for Union of Vietnamese Student Associations. So if anyone has any comments or thoughts, please feel free to share in the chat or unmute as well. All right, so I'm going to read out a response from one of our Zoom room attendees, and they're saying, seeing if I have any friends who might know this individual and might feel comfortable having a restorative conversation with them about why this is inappropriate would be a first step. And that is a great response. That really gets at, delegating to another person and really looping in other people to get their advice, especially if that person might, have a relationship with the person in question, and they can then intervene in that way. So thank you for those thoughts. That's a really great one. Any other thoughts? And I'm seeing in the chat, the relationship is key. It really is super important, thinking about relationships. And I think especially as VSAs, as people in the VSA space, there's this idea of community, right? And we've developed bonds with each other, whether tight or not as tight, and those can really influence the way that you intervene. And we have another response. With this particular identity, I would probably ask why they think the VSA space is for that, or if I'm not comfortable with them in that way, I might mention it to the e-board as well. So I really love this response because that's really taking into account the identity that we added here, right? The cis straight Viet male, because that confers a particular, privilege of being able to intervene while having a certain level of safety that maybe someone who is a cis woman or someone who's a trans woman or non-binary, etc., might not have that same privilege. And the other thing that I really love about that is, mentioning it to the e-board, because that is a form of delegating, and they might have the authority or the relationships to be able to do that. And another thought on my end is, or a tip from my end, would be if you do have the ability to directly intervene, one thing that's helpful is to ask the phrase, "What do you mean by that?" And that just creates like this really small but intentional interruption to the conversation. And it kind of encourages the other person to self-respect or self-reflect and think about what they said, while also allowing you to learn at the same time, and seeing how that might contribute to an unhealthy environment. All right, so those are some great responses. Feel free to continue to add more, but just in the interest of time, we're going to go on to scenario number 2. So this one is slightly longer, but also relevant to the VSA space. A well-known leader is at the camping trip that you and your friends are attending. You, a young new VSA member, generally are not in the same spaces together, so this is one of the first interactions you have with this leader. You and a friend go to the hospitality table to refresh your drinks and snacks when you witness the VSA leader grab a femme-presenting person by the waist who is walking by, and the femme person holding a drink and walking alone, seemingly to join their group of friends, gently says stop, but the leader gets closer to the person, and it doesn't seem like anyone else around the two have noticed what is going on besides you, as they are engaged in their own conversations. So what do you do? I'll give a few moments for that. All right. So reading a response we have from the Zoom room, following up with the femme person to check in with them. And that is super important. So thank you so much for that response. And that is an example of our delay strategy, right? It's following up after. And one thing I did want to note is you are with a friend as well, and you're at the space with a lot of people. So that could be a great opportunity to delegate and have safety in numbers and even split up some tasks. So while you're following up with the person who experienced that harm, the other person might either join you, or they might even talk to VSA leadership to tell them that you're not comfortable attending any other gatherings if that leader is going to be there, and really having a conversation with people, and even seeking out, just like earlier, people who might have a relationship with this well-known leader as well. Yeah, and we're getting another response. You might feel comfortable talking to the person to hang out more or ask more VSA related things to keep them away from the VSA leader. So that is also great as well, because we're starting to think about things like healing and building community, which are super important for survivors as well. All right, thank you all for those great thoughts. So with our last scenario here, you, a cisgender Asian woman, just became a board member for your regional UVSA during COVID-19. Due to this, you all have the privilege of working from home, with all meetings being held virtually through Zoom or Google Meet. In an attempt to build connections beyond the virtual workspace, you add some of your fellow org members on social media, but about a month in, you start to realize that one of your colleagues, who is a cisgender white man, has been consistently engaging in digital blackface. What do you do? And for those of you who aren't familiar, digital blackface is, for example, using GIFs or images of Black people to respond to a thread on Twitter, for example, or using them in a chat conversation, even though you yourself are not Black. So if anyone has thoughts on that. All right, so reading this comment from the Zoom room is just saying, or just responding with a no to show that you disapprove of their use of like that image or that GIF. That's a really great idea. I'd also add maybe using a tactic from earlier is saying, what do you mean by this? Which really offers that opportunity to have that person reconsider as well. And this is where delegate also comes in handy as well, either finding someone who already has trust with that person or someone to help respond in the chat as well. And it looks like Pong has a thought to share, so feel free.
Yeah, so something similar happened when I was a UVSA president before. There was an organization member who posted like a Nazi joke, a Holocaust joke on like their accounts late at night. And so the strategy that I used was direct. So I just directly said, hey there, I think you should take this down. This is like offensive and anti-Semitic. But even before like doing that direct, I first recognized that, oh wait, I actually have a relationship with this person. I've like shared spaces with them, partied with them, hung out together before. And so I approached them in a way that I thought like, oh, okay, you two are cis man. Hopefully you care about like my opinions as well, because we established this bond together. So to just like supplement the direct strategy, sometimes it's helpful if you yourself have a relationship with that person to just do it yourself. Well, another example I like to think about is, okay, if one of your good friends did something bad, like how would you want them to like stop that behavior? And that's a very simplified way of thinking about it, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think again, we're really seeing how important that relationship aspect is. And really sometimes like that's what that person needs to really change that behavior, is to have someone who they have trust in, who they have community with, to be able to tell them not to do that. So thank you. And thank you to everyone who engaged in those last 3 scenarios. One thing I really believe in is co-creating knowledge. And a lot of you brought up points that I would not have thought about, and really creating these ideas together to build a stronger community among us in the UNAVSA community and all the spaces you're in. So I hope that was helpful for you all, thinking about these strategies on how to intervene. I'm going to pass it on to Pong. Do you have any other closing comments as we move into any other questions?
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. So we talked about a lot of things today, provided some answers, not all the answers, because none of us have all the answers. But what we hope from like folks get from this workshop are just like, foundations for us to have other conversations. And we should be having these ongoing conversations with our friends and our community members and family. Something that our board said last year around this time was that safety is not a destination. And so that's really stuck with me for a while. And it's really aligned with a lot of other anti-violence work that I've been studying. And it's that, there's one argument that we can't ever truly be safe. But what we can do is try to provide as much safety and to reduce harm as much as possible in any and all of our spaces. So we hope that, folks are just beginning to think about this, and in doing so, normalizing a culture that, believes survivors, that actively works to prevent violence, a culture that recognizes and wants to destroy rape culture. Like, rape culture should not exist, right? Like, we should be supporting and healing each other. And so, I'm going to provide a link of resources that we prepared for today to our registrants, but I'll also be providing on the side chat bar. At this time, just do folks on the Facebook or on the Zoom have any questions they'd like to pose to us or talk about? Let's do about 2 to 3 minutes for that. Yeah, thank you so much for the affirmations, y'all. I had a response for murder because we didn't really talk about what to do if murder happens. Would folks be interested in hearing?
I'd be interested.
Okay, sure. So earlier we talked about ways we can respond to like rape and physical violence and physical abuse, right? But we didn't really dive into responses for murder. So it's not that I don't have a clear answer or like presenting a clear-cut way to prevent murder. But what I can confidently say is that a lot of the current systems in place that respond to murder aren't stopping it. They're not actually reducing it. Policing and prisons are they're not doing the things that some of us are saying that they do for those of us that support their existence. And a lot of that is because the systems are rooted in like things like cultural and physical genocide of Black and Brown Indigenous people, of colonized people, whether that be like deportations through ICE or, you know, just putting someone and locking them in a cage, dehumanizing them. Many of us here saw like the hypervisibility of like harm happen, right, in the police murders of numerous Black and Brown people. Separating people, putting community members, elders, youth, disabled people into cages, depriving people of resources. Prisons and policing also, because resources are funneled into these systems, and we're seeing that happen right now within the United States specifically, it means that the communities outside those walls, the resources are being taken away from them because every resource and money is being funneled to keeping those institutions of punishment and of violence alive. And yeah, like we know like a prison is a rapist is what another educator says. They are sites of sexual violence. Like the entire prevalence of prison rape jokes, dropping the soap, right? Or whatever memes about R. Kelly or Derek Chauvin that came up this past year about, you know, going to jail and then they'll be harmed in jail. Like those are like admissions that prisons are violent, right? And that's what I think some people don't realize. And you don't have to be an abolitionist to admit that fact that these are sites of like violence. So we may be wondering, okay, what can we do? So what we can do is actually work to prevent and address like murder and rape in ways that, you know, center healing, that centers survivors' needs. We have to like experiment and continue to experiment to address like all forms of violence. One of the ways that we're doing that is right now in this long-term struggle and education to end rape culture, to end a culture that enables rape. Organizer Dean Spade says that the prison is not a way to stop rape, the prison is the rapist. So,
yeah, thank you for that, Pong. And I think with that last part about you know, really experimenting with these spaces, that really resonated with me. And I remember I was reading through the What About the Rapists zine by Miriam Kaba and Eva Miguel. And that's in the document for those of you who are still on the call. And I can like link it here too, but it's that really great analogy where it's like if incarceration is like a hamburger stand in the middle of a desert and it happens to be a really, you know, like bad hamburger stand, like you never know if there's like better options of food that you can be getting in your space if you're not being given other options. So that experimentation aspect of it, I really appreciate that thought.